Hello my friends, Blackendrose here, and we are back with Kerbal Training Academy. Now, as you know, the last informational video that I did on this had a bit of an audio problem. Yes, that was a bit unfortunate. But anyways, we're going to move on from that. I will cover the material that got lost in the previous video, and we will move on from there. I've changed my recording setup slightly to see if that handles it better. So, in the last episode, we learned how to build rockets and how to get, well, basically how to build a basic rocket to get up into orbit. Now, the part that did break was referring to, like, the actual getting myself into orbit. So what I'm going to do is take the same craft again. Now, unfortunately, we won't have Jebediah because Jebediah is in orbit. So what we'll do is we'll launch this one again. If you want to know about building this particular rocket, go back to the first episode where I explain it in very poor detail there. But we're on the ground now. So what we're going to do is first press T to activate the SAS, which we can use when we have a pilot or when we have a unmanned probe part that has this function, or if we attach an SAS module. But we'll go into that later. So throttle up and ignition. Now, as I described in the previous episode, what I tend to do is, from an early point, is I just adjust my trajectory slightly to the right. Now what this will do, at the moment, the rocket is trying to push through the lower atmosphere, which is the densest part of the atmosphere. So we're getting a lot of drag going on. So we're trying to push against the air and trying to cut through it. That's why we need to have the nose cones on there to try and help it cut through the air better. So we're almost out of solid fuel, and we're reaching further up into the atmosphere where there is less, well, there's less to push through. Now I'm going to let this coast for a little bit. Okay. Right, wait for it. The thrust is already at max, so what we're going to do is attach and fire the liquid engine. So now we go to the map and we see we are at this point. So what I'm going to do is turn the engine off and just adjust our trajectory. As you can see in the nav ball in the bottom, is adjust the trajectory to cut across there. So what we're going to do now is we are going to try and even out our orbital position. Now we're a little bit higher than I wanted to be, but that's okay. What we want to do is try and extend this out into a circle without getting us much higher. Now we can do this at this point, but it's not all that efficient, but it's useful at this point. So what we'll do is we'll cut the engines there. Now we just need to wait for a little bit. Move my chair across. Alright, and we just adjust the time warp a little bit. Okay, so now we're at this point, we're close to the apoapsis. Right, now we just fire again. And what we want to do is just try and push this orbit out so it just sort of becomes more circular. Okay, so we've now run out of fuel on this stage. So detach and ignition. Now there should be more than enough fuel for us to circularize our orbit. And there's the periapsis. And we are now in a stable orbital position with a whole bunch of fuel left. I'm just going to extend this just for the hell of it. Okay, so we are now in orbit as I've just described. So let's get down to some of the meat of this. We needed this here, which is a solar panel. We We need this to generate electricity, which obviously we get from the sun. Let me pull this up. We need electricity because we can't actually perform any maneuvers without it, which obviously makes things quite tricky. We have the batteries on because once this craft moves away from direct sunlight, we're going to be draining power. The SAS drains power. The actual, what you could say, life support of the command module and of drone modules uses a small amount of power. Your Kerbal won't die unless you put the mods in for it. They won't die in orbit, but without power they can't actually do anything. So they'll be trapped in orbit, and then you'll have to send up a craft to rescue them. But that gets into some very complicated stuff. Right, let's get down to some of the other parts as well. The apoapsis is the highest point of an orbit. So it will always be the part that has the highest altitude, and the periapsis is, by contrast, the lower altitude in an orbit. As long as your periapsis is not below 70,000 meters or 70 kilometers, you will continually orbit Kerbin just constantly. You will never fall back to the planet. Actual orbit mechanics work a little bit differently from that, but in Kerbal Space Program, that's how it works. So once you have established an orbit like this, you are perfectly fine. If you want to push your orbit out, all you need to do, I'll engage the SAS, is you need to push out the apostasis, which is this circular symbol here. So we'll just do that just now. And the periapsis goes out, and the apostasis moves along. So if you want to circularize your orbit so that it's more balanced, you need to wait until you're at the apostasis, and then push out what's called a prograde thrust, which basically means that you engage your engines facing the apostasis so that you push out the periapsis, and so it just balances out. There's a lot of terms I'm using here, but basically all you need to remember is I call it apostasis, but it's apoapsis. That is the highest point of the orbit. The periapsis is the lowest part of the orbit. To make your orbit, to basically have a larger orbit, you need to do what's called a prograde burn, not prograde thrust, a prograde burn, which is, as you can see here, is this symbol. A retrograde burn does the opposite. It actually shrinks your orbit. So if you want to have a tighter orbit, so you circle the planet quicker, then you want to have a tighter orbit. If you want to circle the planet slower, you need to have a higher orbit. Because basically the way this works is, your orbit is you falling back to the planet because of gravity, but because you're going around it, the planet is never actually catching you. You never actually reach the planet, so you're constantly falling at a set speed, which is the speed we see here. To decrease that speed, you need to be further away so that the gravity has a weaker effect. At this point as well, we can also explore what delta V is. Now, delta V is a bit of an abstract concept, but I will try and be as simple as possible. Delta V is a representation, or the best way I can describe it, is a representation in a change of velocity. So, for me to speed up this craft from the current velocity to a faster velocity, I have to accelerate. The actual measure of the acceleration is the delta V applied. Now, delta V is affected by the mass of the craft and the thrust being pushed out alongside the fuel used for it. So basically, this craft I have here is really small, really light. So this tiny engine that I've got on here, which produces really weak thrust but is very fuel efficient, can push this thing very easily. If I had a much larger craft, much heavier craft, then this tiny engine wouldn't have the thrust to push the craft and thus change the velocity. So I could have a ton of fuel, but the delta V would never change because there is no change in velocity. By that token as well, a less fuel efficient but powerful engine will be able to push a larger craft as well as smaller craft, but it would burn through its fuel quicker. So the relative delta V balances out. It gets very complicated, and without mods like MechJeb, it's kind of hard to describe. But basically, delta V is a representation of a change of velocity. A bigger engine with more powerful thrust will apply more delta V per second, whereas a smaller engine applies less delta V per second but uses less fuel. But obviously, because of the smaller thrust, you run into a problem of larger craft can't be affected by it. I actually ran into this problem when I tried to move an asteroid, and I had a craft with an engine like this, and it was like, it wouldn't do anything, because I'm trying to move something that is tons and tons of rock. I was like, that was a mistake. But anyway, at the moment, we can still maneuver around. It's generally handy to have the SAS on. Oh, I've left it on in the wrong position. It's handy to have the SAS on because it will balance out your maneuvers. So, just a moment. Right, okay, sorry about that. And I can exit the craft with my person and just move around a bit. I can jump off and press the R button to engage the little jetpack on them and move around. This is handy if you need to move between craft, or if you have some other mods on. You can use it to build craft in space. But let's just reboard again. Now, the communication setup, I'll go into more detail when we start look at launching communication probes. But that becomes important when we look at the connection to the Space Center, which is more prevalent in the career mode. When you have a pilot, you don't need to have a connection to the Space Center, because for all intents and purposes, the pilot is flying the craft. If you have unmanned craft, you need a direct connection to Space Central to perform any maneuvers. That's where relay satellites come into play, because you have to have basically a line of sight to the Space Center. I'll go into that in more detail when we actually start reaching relay satellites, but for the time being, let's get this craft back to Earth. So we're going to do a controlled re-entry. I'm not going to try and land at Kerbal Space Center because I haven't quite mastered that yet. But in order for us to return back to Kerbin, we need to do a retrograde burn. So we'll do one here. Now, for the most fuel efficient form, you want to be at the apoapsis and bring the periapsis down. So what we're going to do now is we're facing a retrograde direction. We'll thrust. Keep thrusting. Okay, so now that the periapsis has dropped down to below 70 kilometers, we will be caught in the atmosphere. This might not be enough for us to come down. What I tend to do is go to about 55. Although if your apoapsis is further out, you might have to circle a few times. What this does is what I call aero capture. I think there's actually a proper term for it, but we'll leap ahead a little bit. And yeah, once we go below 70k, we start, the time warp stops. Now what you want to do at this point is you want to try and keep yourself in this sort of setup. I mean, for this kind of craft, the engine can handle only so much frictional heat, and we'll start noticing what starts to happen. But basically, try and keep your craft focused in this direction for these kind of maneuvers. Now what will happen, you'll see the apoapsis is starting to decrease. We are at the very tips of the atmosphere, the very edge of the atmosphere at the moment, so it's starting to cause drag, which means that we're starting to slow down ever so slowly because we're trying to cut through the atmosphere. This is a very fuel efficient method of returning back to the planet. rather than burning fuel to slow yourself down, you can actually let the atmosphere do some of the work for you. The only risk that comes with that is that when you're using the atmosphere to slow you down, you have to deal with heat through friction. Now what happens is, unless you use some of the easier game settings, is each of these parts has a certain amount of heat tolerance. Like some of the more sciencey parts are much more delicate than, say, the engine itself. So what will happen is that, in fact, we'll speed this up a little bit. But as you can see, the apoapsis is still decreasing. We'll just wait for it. You'll see it happening because we're going at such a fast speed at the moment. We're at the tip of the atmosphere, so we're not getting much atmosphere to break through, even at these speeds. So it's relatively okay at the moment. I wonder if this is actually going to work. The apoapsis is still rather high. Okay, I think this isn't going to work just yet. So what we'll do, and this is also quite fuel efficient as well, is to burn fuel at this point, because that will bring us down. You can also, I haven't put any thrusters on this, like RCS thrusters, but you can use that as well to do much more minute directional changes. Now what's going to happen now is, because we've passed the periapsis, we're actually going to increase our altitude slightly, but because our apoapsis is below 70k, we're going down one way or another. So our altitude is going to continually increase slightly, but as you can see, everything's starting to turn around because we're reaching the peak of our altitude. Don't worry, we will get Jebediah back, but it's actually quite useful having him there. Our altitude is... No, sorry, our altitude is slowing down. No, our speed is slowing down slightly, but that should increase again when we start going down. This is only happening because our altitude's going up. And as you can see from the dial up here, our altitude is very slowly balancing out. And now we're going down. Wait a minute. No, now we're going down. So very soon we will start to see the visual changes that occur from re-entry. So we just have to wait for it for a little bit. Yeah, our altitude really is going down there. I mean, we'll start going down much faster soon. But because this is a small and relatively light craft, the atmosphere can help slow it down much better than, say, a more aerodynamic craft or a much heavier craft. One of the benefits that come with a larger craft is that they're not as aerodynamic, so they're actually caught by the air better, so they actually slow down better. Whereas smaller craft like this, they cut through the air a lot quicker, so the atmosphere doesn't slow them down quite as much, and you might have to use some fuel to slow you down enough. But we have 3 parachutes. Now, you don't want to activate those too soon, because they have a tolerance on them. Oh yeah, here we go. So, we are now showing signs of friction through the atmosphere. Now at the moment we're quite safe because we're still quite high in the atmosphere. There isn't a lot of air to cut through. But as you can see, we're starting to get some readings coming up. Yeah, this is what happens with overheating. These components are starting to overheat because they're getting the friction is causing too much heat on them. We're coming down quite fast. Now we are slowing down, but we're not slowing down very quickly. In fact, let me slow that down. Now, the outer components are the ones that are heating up more because they're more delicate. They can't handle the tolerance quite as well. What I do sometimes is I spin sometimes because what that does is that disperses the friction. Now, it doesn't always work. It's quite a handy stopgap. But as we descend further into the atmosphere, we're cutting through thicker and thicker air, so there's more friction. Even the engine is starting to overheat now. Now, if it reaches its full tolerance level, like the bar goes all the way to the top, the part will explode. So we don't want that. That's why we want the engine to take this, because the engine is a more robust part. Now what you can do is, what I'm going to do now, is you can detach, because I've already set this up. In fact, let me just pause it for a moment. As you can see here, we have the engine, we have another detachment point, and then we have the parachute. What I did in the rocket construction stage, and it's in the first episode as well, is I attached a heat shield to the bottom of the command module. Now what that does is it takes the frictional heat and then it disperses it into, well, away from the craft by using what's known as ablator. It's kind of like a material that breaks down and flies away. It takes the heat with it. So as long as there's ablator and the heat shield is the focal point of the heat, then all the other components will be fine. It kind of works as like being a buffer for heat resistance when entering the atmosphere. So, what we'll do is detach. Now we have a much lighter part because there's no fuel on this, and the heat shield is now working because we're losing ablator, but no other parts are exposed. So we are quite safe at the moment. So now all we need to do is just wait for now. And again, because this is a very light part, it's just the command module, the atmosphere is slowing it down much quicker. Also, it's not aerodynamic, so there's more of a surface area to be trying to push through the atmosphere. So now we just wait for a little bit. As you can see, we are slowing down much quicker now. And we still have a lot more altitude to get through. We're not even into the mid atmosphere level, which we should be. Yeah, we're in that now. So now we just need to wait for our craft to slow down a bit more. And now that we're in the atmosphere, we can deploy the parachutes, but it's not a good idea to do that yet, because as you can see, right, okay, now it's safe to deploy the parachutes. We have gone down to a speed slow enough for the parachutes not to break. So, deploy the chutes. Right, now the craft is entirely safe now, unless I detach the chutes again. It looks like we're going to be splashing down for this one. But now all we need to do is just wait for the craft to come down. There's no more heat through friction, because we're not going fast enough to generate any frictional heat. We're still slowing down gradually, but we're slow enough now for the parachutes to stop us as we go down. So now all we do is wait. The parachutes need to be at a certain altitude before they open out fully. At the moment they haven't opened out yet. They've just been deployed. So let's just wait for now. We'll just speed that up. Right. Parachute. Two of the parachutes have opened. The last one hasn't opened yet, I don't think. No, it has opened. Okay. So now the craft is coming down at a much more moderate, about 3.5 meters a second. That craft could land on solid ground at that speed and not break apart. So this is coming down nice and smoothly now. So now we just have to wait. And that is a successful re-entry for Valentina Kerbin. Now we just have to wait for a while for this craft to come down. But this was a very basic construction, using more of the basic parts. So to make something larger to go up into orbit, you just have to scale it up. So if you have larger fuel tanks or more mass, you need to have more thrust to push it up. But of course, with more thrust, you need more fuel to compensate for that, and then you have more mass, so then you need more thrust. It becomes a balancing act. But if you bear in mind how much of a rocket was used to get into orbit, this is what's come back. Like 95% of a rocket is getting it into orbit. And there we go. Recover vessel, mission completed. We've been to orbit, we've made it back. A successful mission. So let's just visit Jebediah, who is still in orbit from last time. And bearing in mind he had the same craft as well. So he's up here, jollying it up. Blimey, he seems happy. Let's just turn you around so that the solar panel's facing the sun and your batteries will charge up. And yeah, so that got us into orbit. We've successfully got the same craft back from orbit. So perfectly fine. If you attached science modules onto the craft, you could have performed science experiments in orbit, come back and brought the science back home. But that's in the science mode and the career mode. At the moment this is the sandbox mode, so we don't need any of that. But basically the science mode and career mode introduce money into it, missions, and doing science experiments to accumulate science points, which you spend in the science lab to get more parts. But we'll go back to the Space Center. And there we are, fellow cadets. That was a review of successful orbiting, some other mechanics to bear in mind, and and successfully returning from orbit around Kerbin. Now, what I intend to do is to review some of the other parts of this game, such as establishing a relay satellite network, which I've done successfully, orbital rendezvous, the basics of docking, and of course the famous reaching the moon. But we'll go into all of those at later episodes as I get them out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm blackendrose, and I will see you in the next Kerbal Training Academy training video. And remember, my friends, be yourself, be awesome. Bye bye.